Hello everyone, hope you're well. My name is Jake Norman, the host of the Best in Property podcast. My guest today is the head of Build to Rent at Lambert Smith Hampton in Manchester. A great guy who I've met previously and has spoken at many different events, including the PRS conference that Place Northwest held a couple of months ago. This gentleman has played a huge role in the growth in Build to Rent across the northern markets, advising some of the largest institutional partners on various different Build to Rent investments across, like I said, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, and all around the UK. So my guest today is Ian Scott from Lambert Smith Hampton.
Hello and welcome to the Best in Property podcast with Jake Notman. The podcast where you get to access the best property leaders around the world. From the biggest developers in the UK to the largest property investors across the globe. We pick the brains and answer the questions you've always wanted to ask. Enjoy.
Ian, hope you're well. My name is Jake Norman and this is the Best in Property podcast. My guest today is Ian Scott from Lambert Smith Hampton. How's everything going right now, Ian?
Yeah, good. Considering.
Considering, yeah, I think it's an interesting time for us all. I know we've spoken quite a few times or so, but I guess the lockdown period as to where things are up to. But how is business right now? How is, I guess, discussions with clients in terms of where they're up to, I guess, and their position on the market right now?
Yeah, I think it depends in terms of the transactions that we're looking at. It totally depends on what it is, where it is, and the fundamentals of a deal. So, for example, in the land market, we do quite a few land deals. It seems to be that everyone's suggesting that they're looking for a bargain. As land values arguably will decrease across the next 12, 18 months. So there's quite a lot of demand in that space. But I suppose the problem with that is that the more demand there is, the more pricing won't change. But we're hoping for a bit of a correction there and a flurry of land transactions, almost like a new cycle, really. On the income producing resi side, the core capital markets, residential capital markets, again, really busy. We've got a lot of demand for stable income where you've got a freehold self-contained residential building that is providing an income, has good track record of income and op costs, and you're simply coming in to buy the income or potentially create some value add if there's a refurb angle or whatever. But even on the shiny BTR side, if we've got stable income producing investments, we're awash with demand, really. So that's all good. I think the big challenge that we've seen across the last couple of months, and I think we will see for the remainder of 2020, in all honesty, is the institutional forward funding market, which is simply on pause. They're not committing to new transactions, really. We've not seen any major deals that weren't already substantially progressed get over the line during this period. So it's kind of watch this space. I'd imagine it will be on pause until at least the end of this year, and it might be Q1, Q2 next year before the institutions get back into that space.
For sure. Yeah, no, definitely. I think from my side as well, definitely agree with all you're saying there. Conversations are, like I said, I think it's just waiting for that. I guess the value of the valuations as well with a lot of these things is our price is going to drop. And I think when you're buying a project and funding a project at £50 million plus, you want to make sure that you get at the right price. So, I mean, Build to Rent has grown massively over the last few years, Ian. Obviously, you know it more than most people as to where I guess these hotspots have started to open up. Where do you think the future holds for Build to Rent? Because obviously you mentioned forward funding is going to be on the pause for the rest of this year. Is there going to be a strategy change for funds as to what they look at in terms of different markets? Is it more housing-led schemes? Where do you think the future is going to be for, I guess, forward funding and Build to Rent over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think you'll see massive progression in terms of the lessons learned. So the last 5 to 10 years really has been a period of inception of a brand new market. Inception, delivery, stabilization, and then learning the lessons. And I think particularly around the operational phase of these buildings, because ultimately up until 4, 5, 6 years ago, nobody in the UK had operated and leased up a building in this manner, really. So I think, we've gone through that learning curve, and I think the city centre market will definitely benefit from that going forwards. And you'll see now maybe a second generation of product that is almost designed utilising the lessons that have been learned over the last 5 years. So great examples, and I always bang on about these examples, but number one, Greengate in Manchester was probably one of the first ever BTR deals. Come Christmas time, they've not got nowhere near enough storage for the parcels that get delivered to the building. So that's a lesson learned in terms of both design and operation. Amenity, what amenities getting used? The gym at number one Greengate, great example again. They had to take out 2 income producing resi investments to extend the gym because it was that busy in the mornings. So again, lesson learned. And I think that's what we'll see in city centre BTR is a more refined product based on actual evidence and customer satisfaction. So I think that's the exciting bit about city centre BTR. But that's not going to go away. There's a lot of chat about the suburban market. City centre BTR will not go away because in your major conurbations like Manchester and Birmingham and Bristol and obviously London, people, particularly younger people, do want to live on the doorstep of where they work and play. And that primarily for young people is in city centres. So we certainly don't think that the city centre market is going to change rapidly at all in terms of demand. And if Manchester again, it's a great example because the graduate retention is just phenomenal. Not only have you got Manchester graduate retention, but you've then got graduate migration from other key cities like Leeds and Sheffield and Liverpool, who all seem to descend primarily on Manchester at the moment. And these young 21 to 30-year-old people, 9 times out of 10, I'd say, ain't going to go and rent a house in Didsbury. They're going to spend the first 4 or 5 years in the city centre, at least. So I think that market is still and will continue to be strong. But on the other hand, that next generation of people who have enjoyed the city for the last 5-6 years and are getting that bit older and want to graduate themselves onto the suburban market, I think the 2 drivers behind BTR in suburbs will be the ability to buy your own house. Because again, if you want to buy a house in the suburb of Manchester, actually it's not that affordable at all. So therefore you might be forced into the position of renting. But equally, renting in that generation of people is definitely a lifestyle choice now. So whilst that market might contain people who have the ability to buy a house, they might think, you know what, actually, yeah, we're going to try Levenshulme, but in actual fact, we want to rent for the first 12, 18 months to see if we really like it. And I think that's going to be quite a big market on top of all the people that are already in that space and in that private rented sector in the suburbs of big conurbations who want to be close to amenity, close to decent transport infrastructure, can get into town in 20 minutes, out of town in 20 minutes, and enjoy a bit more space and a suburban lifestyle as opposed to a city centre lifestyle. And the product doesn't really exist. So it'll be fascinating to see how both developers and investors unlock some opportunities, really.
For sure. I guess following on from that, in terms of obviously institutions that have always been city centre based, I mean, if you were to, I guess, give some advice to the clients now, whether it's I don't know, M&G, for example, or one of the, I guess, the bigger players in the market who do look for, I guess, your city centre stuff, would you be giving them some advice to look at the smaller towns outside of the city centres, or would you sort of say, look, let's, I guess, hold as much as we can and wait until we find the right opportunities and just go all in on city centre, or is it a case of, I don't know, mixing, the balance of the portfolio right now?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's the case. I think you want a diverse portfolio, really. If you have a residential income producing portfolio, it can be more diverse than just BTR in a city centre. And I think that's what's interesting, actually, because the argument for major funds coming into this market is diversification of commercial portfolios of real estate in the UK, which are clearly challenged right now. If you're overweight on offices or retail, not great. But actually, if you've got residential and beds in your portfolio, it works really, really well. But on top of that, it's not just city centre BTR. In your beds kind of space of your pie diagram in your portfolio, you've actually got city centre BTR. You've then got 5 or 6 suburban schemes, call it 100 units each. So that's 500 suburban units. And then you might have some 55 plus living and some retirement living as well, etc., etc. And you might even have some service departments and a hotel. And there's beds, a real diverse portfolio itself of beds. And the best thing about that is that you are capturing as much demand in that private rented sector as you possibly can. You're getting bums on seats across the whole of the spectrum, literally from studio apartments in the city centre all the way through to 3-4 bed detached housing, and then the 55 plus market. So you really can create quite a unique portfolio if you want to. But again, we're in a brand new market and it's still brand new. You know, we're still in the inception phase, particularly suburban now, of BTR. And we'll still continue for the next 20 years, really, going through this delivery phase of product.
For sure. No, I definitely think in terms of the city centre stuff, we've had a few years at it, but definitely in suburban areas, it's not even really started at all yet, has it? I mean, in terms, obviously, in comparison to other markets, I mean, the US has adopted, I guess, the multifamily housing model for quite some time, and other European countries have done similar. Why do you think the UK's only, I guess, these last few years come to, I guess, the products of build to rent? Why do you think we have played a bit of catch up as to these types of schemes? I guess institutional investors now looking at the UK as a prime market for this type of investment.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think culturally in the UK we're still obsessed with home ownership.
Yeah.
The stats in the press across the last few months, you know, if you can't go a day doesn't go by that you don't see a headline in relation to house pricing. And that's because as a nation of people, we're absolutely obsessed with it. And we almost use it as a metric of how the economy is performing. Really, that's not what people should be looking at. They should be looking at the gilt rates. They should be looking at the base rate from the Bank of England. They should be looking at the rate of CPI and not necessarily home ownership and rates of growth. But for whatever reason, culturally, we are obsessed with home ownership. And really, you know, I've been talking a good game for BTR for years now, but culturally, I don't see that changing rapidly anyway, on the basis that the government, again, they're so obsessed with allowing young people in particular to get the foot on the property ladder with help to buy, etc., etc. So I think there is a cultural challenge there. But ultimately, home ownership is challenging for young people, irrespective of what the government have done across the last 5, 6, 7 years. It's a challenge. You know, it really is difficult to save for a deposit as well as have a nice lifestyle, unless you've got the bank of mum and dad. And the vast majority of the population in the UK don't have the bank of mum and dad with 20, 30 grand sat there so that the kids can go and buy the first house. And then the generation that's definitely coming through now do choose to have enjoyment over savings. So the likelihood of a 21-year-old graduate now is that he's going to think a bit less about saving for a deposit, and he might be saving up for a trip to Thailand and 4 months away in Thailand. And that's just the reality of where we're at. So I think it's all cultural, but the barriers to home ownership definitely create an environment where there's more and more people in the private rented sector, and the age at which you come out of the private rented sector is shifting up and up and up and up drastically, and then every year you've still got new young people coming into that market, and that's why there is sufficient demand for big schemes, both suburban and in our city centres.
For sure. No, I agree with all your points. And something which I wanted to touch on, Ian, was, I guess, as you know yourself, within, I guess, build to rent, I think the whole of the northern markets has been, I guess, booming in many ways over the last few years. Fractional sales has played a big part in plot sales for developers across the UK, individual investors to bring in from Hong Kong, Singapore, wherever it is in the world. I think as that market slightly changes, volumes slightly tend to drop, have dropped recently because of everything that's gone on. And developers now, when they're building 400 units, if they only sell 100 out of those 400, then they're in a bit of a difficult situation. So in terms of, my question is, a lot of developers are going to be sat on schemes which I guess have consent purposely for build to sell. What advice would you give to developers now who are sat on good sites that may or may not work for build to rent? Is it a case of go straight back into to get resubmission to get the consent for a build to rent products, or would you try, I guess, work with the schemes that they've got right now and try and, I guess, give it a different angle on it? Because I know from recent conversations myself, there's a lot of developers now that they're not looking to sell overseas in terms of one by one investors. Sorry, they are looking now for that one transaction buyer. What advice would you give to developers sat on great sites right now?
Yeah, I mean, the first bit of advice I would always suggest in that situation is that you own the core asset, and the inception of a development is the land. And as I mentioned, whilst we're expecting a slight correction in the land market, the reality is, as I also alluded to, is that the demand is so high. I mean, we must have 20, 30 inquiries every week in respect of land and developers searching for city centre land across the whole of the north of England. And whilst that demand exists, actually, you might look at trading the land if you did buy it well with a planning consent. But if developers, as often is the case, actually are obsessed with delivery, then I would certainly look at the BTR model and that institutional funding piece if the timing's going to work in regards of recovery from COVID and the pricing sensible, because we're still, the pricing of BTR is a way off what you would achieve in the likes of, the Far East or China on a buy-to-let investment basis. So you've got to balance that, though, with the proposition of being fully forward funded and taking no exit risk or very limited exit risk. So it really is a balance. But actually, I think one thing that we don't see very often at all, and I've been speaking about this for some time as well, and there's a couple of reasons for it, but what we don't often see at all is developers delivering BTR with a combination of third-party debt and equity, controlling the stabilisation and the lease-up of the asset, and then in year 2 or 3, from practical completion, trading an income-producing asset rather than doing a forward funding deal. And it would be far more lucrative to do that. The yield, you'd be talking more like 4% on the yield rather than 5%. So if there's 75 to 100 basis points on forward funding versus stable stock, the developer would benefit in that. The challenge, of course, is securing sufficient debt and equity resources to deliver that, because the debt markets still, pre-financial crash, had not fully recovered in actual fact, particularly from a loan-to-value perspective. So you do need a massive slug of equity that's got to go in there to get from A to B. And then equally, I think now, given COVID, I certainly don't see loan-to-value ratios getting super competitive anytime soon, albeit interest rates, particularly investment-led income-producing interest rates for stable investment product, will be very, very lucrative, but at very sensible LTV. So one way to definitely get from A to B is if you can deliver it yourself and lease the thing up.
Interesting. And something which I wanted to bring up, Ian, I mean, I was at I believe it was the PRS conference earlier on this year. I know you were on the panel, obviously discussing potential new areas of obviously regeneration in the future. You spoke briefly on obviously places like Oldham, Rochdale, Stockport, and as I think we mentioned briefly on the podcast earlier, that funds are now looking at, I guess, alternative areas. Do you think those, I guess, smaller towns such as Rochdale, Oldham, and Stockport will get a lot more attention? And I guess, how do you advise clients on to capitalise on the opportunity on the early stages right now?
I certainly do. And I'm quite passionate about it, actually, because the BTR model should not just be reserved for young professionals who are pretty well to do in the city centre. The BTR model, where you've got an institutional landlord providing a high level of customer service and security and good repair obligations, i.e., if your boiler breaks, I'm an institutional landlord, I'm going to come and fix it within 24 hours. That's the level of service that's actually needed in the deprived areas of somewhere like Greater Manchester, but across the whole of the UK, really. And where towns are more deprived, this model could work absolutely perfectly to actually create a bit more of an aspirational product for people who genuinely need it. I suppose that the difficult thing when it comes to the likes of Oldham and Rochdale and places like that is that it's the viability, because the rental values versus the yield are probably going to kick out, I don't know, somewhere between 150 and 165 pounds a square foot. Now, you can't buy your land and deliver the thing and make a profit for that kind of level. So it's almost chicken and egg, really. That said, I almost feel like the councils in those areas can definitely get themselves into a position where where they can help subsidise development, and whether or not that is through grants or whether they can take an income strip lease or whatever. I definitely think that the local authorities in those areas can and should be a bit more proactive in terms of trying to push this model forwards. But only time will tell, really. Only time will tell.
For sure. And in terms, obviously, working on these deals, they're not small deals, and forward funding deals can go on for 6, 12, 18, 2 years sometimes. What do you think stops build to rent projects getting started? Is it build costs? Is it how the scheme's designed? What do you, in across schemes, there's a generic, issue that stops the scheme? What do you think that would be?
Yeah, I think there's 2 or 3 key factors. The first is micro-location. If you cannot persuade an institutional investor that you're in a perfect micro-location, and whether that's because it's already super prime or there's substantial regeneration, etc., then you're snookered from day one. So really, if you actually look at the BTR schemes that have been delivered across the whole of the UK, they're all in pretty sweet micro-locations. You very rarely see massively peripheral delivery being BTR. And a lot of the time, the core funds in the market are not they're not the first mover in regeneration zones. The BTR bit might come a bit later on. So definitely micro location. We get tons of sites across our desk, and it's like, do you think this would work? And you've got to be honest. When if it's quite a way out of the major conurbation of any city, then it's just not going to work. So I think that's the first one. The second, actually, build cost is a big factor, and viability overall, because suddenly in Manchester, if you've paid 25 grand a plot for your land, your build costs are 185 quid a foot, plus your professional fees, plus your agency fees, of course. Suddenly can't forget that. But suddenly then your profit's like 5% on cost, and the developer's just thinking, well, it's not worth the risk because you have got to take some risk. The construction timescales never ever are on time, ever. There's not been one scheme in Manchester delivered in the last 4 years for a BTR investor that's been on time, which is ludicrous. Contractors are going bust here, there and everywhere. So it really is a risk, So it's not just that you can, as a developer, say, oh, well, you know what, we'll take a 5% margin in a DM because we've got no exit risk, because other risks do exist during that process. So that's definitely a key driver as well in terms of schemes not coming forwards. And then last but not least, I always, we always make a point of this, and a good piece of advice actually to any developers trying to get into this sort of market and get forward funding is that the track record of the delivery partner needs to be tip top. So the developer needs to be able to present to the likes of, I don't know, Aberdeen Standard Life, Legal & General, M&G, present to a fund manager there that they are a very credible developer with a good track record. And I suppose it's tricky because it's a new market. And in a new market, you get new entrants and entrepreneurs who have not actually got that much track record, but they have got themselves into a position where they might have secured an absolutely prime site, and they've pulled together a contractor and they've agreed a fixed price JCT contract, and they have managed to be very entrepreneurial, pull it all together, find a forward funder, and then the forward funder is really then starting to interrogate their balance sheet and the historic delivery of projects. So anything you can do really to bolster experience and delivery in the market, and I suppose it's probably frustrating because you might have to start smaller than you want to, but that track record and that history of delivery is absolutely crucial.
For sure. I guess it makes it slightly easier being, if you're a UK institution, obviously you've got guys on the ground, you may have an office in London or whatever it is, regional offices. As an overseas institution, maybe from the Middle East or Singapore, and you quite like the idea of build to rent. What again, I'm asking for all this advice, but as an institutional investor in, a market which has never been into the UK, or a fund that's never been into the UK, what advice would you give? Is it start with making sure the contract is liquid in terms of cash? Is it all these types of things? What advice would you give them? And I guess my second point on that is, how would you onboard them as a client throughout that process? Is it a case of, right, someone comes in and says, Ian, I want to obviously look into the build to rent market. Do you try and get them on deal straight away? Is it an education process, and could it take 6 to 12 months? Or if you give us a bit of how Lambert Smith Hampton, deal with a client, that'd be quite interesting as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think the first phase is definitely education. If it's an overseas investor, the first thing we'd suggest is that they get themselves over to the UK, and we can take them for a tour of the top 5 or 6 cities, and we can explore what return profiles they're looking for and what kind of risk they're willing to take to get those return profiles. Or on the flip side, if they're quite risk averse and they want to, for example, secure income producing assets. But it definitely then starts with, right, well, what cities do we think are the best cities in terms of demand and growth? And then we get into those cities, and then what micro locations and opportunities are available. And we'll run some mock examples of what that looks like. But equally, I think it's definitely a case of getting around a few developments from an investor's point of view, and again, understanding what's worked, what hasn't worked, what does the building manager wish they would have changed or had the ability to change day one, and really get under the skin of the fact that these are going to be operational buildings with customers living in them. It's not just bricks and mortar real estate investment. It's almost a business. Each building is its own business, and that's the way we'd approach it. But I suppose that I made a good point actually there about risk and reward, because as I've mentioned previously, if you want high return levels, you might have to develop yourself, or forward funding is the way forward. And if you don't want to take so much risk, then you're going to have to pay the price and buy some income producing BTR, which is 4%, or dare I even say it. And there's a lot of chat in the market at the minute about sub 4% on central Manchester BTR, which is income producing. So it's all about the IRR profiles really that the investors need to hit. But again, the UK is a great market. I think we sometimes we don't do ourselves enough of a favour in terms of selling the United Kingdom to overseas investors. I think particularly across the last 3 years with what's gone on with Brexit, etc., we should be using that as an opportunity, particularly the pound sterling at the moment, still weak compared to the vast majority of major currencies. We should be absolutely selling our wares. And particularly when you've got cities like London and Bristol, Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, that have got great growth stories, a concept of urbanisation, and absolutely, floods and floods of demand in the rental market. It really needs to be sold in the right manner. And I suppose that's where the big surveying practices such as LSH and our competitors probably actually need to up our game in terms of selling the UK as a concept.
For sure. You mentioned, obviously, I think it was at the start of the call or off the call, it was the media's a very interesting. It's very interesting how it portrays the UK. One day it's great, one day it's not so great. Prices dropping, prices increasing. I'm definitely in agreement. The UK is an amazing market in many ways. If you look at it in comparison to, I guess, markets across the world, the UK fundamentally is quite strong. But I think we just need to speak sometimes a bit more positively about it. But in something slightly off topic in relation to projects is, planning is always a consideration for build-to-rent projects specifically, and obviously how it's designed. I guess what in terms obviously to minimise the risk of getting a refusal on build-to-rent. You probably know more than me of schemes that have been refused. What advice would you give to developers right now looking to make sure they're designing an efficient scheme ready for consent?
Yeah, well, God, I always think just get in and see the local authority sooner rather than later. You can talk to them about your ambitions, how you see a particular site coming forward. If it's part of a strategic regeneration framework or a master plan, you've got to be working with the local authority to match their intentions and ambitions. But ultimately as well, I feel that that you should be, or developer needs to be going in again with the right advisors from day one, suggesting that it's going to be a BTR scheme, because local authorities still need this education process themselves over what BTR actually is and entails. And the fundamental problem, actually, and again, this is something that people who know I've been banging on about for years now, is the fact that BTR doesn't have its own use class. It's a C3 use class at the end of the day. And what that means is that from a Section 106 perspective in particular, that you almost get penalised when you're delivering BTR on the basis that if the unit sale value is, say, $350 a foot, but the BTR value to institutional investors is 300 quid a square foot, the local authority are using the for sales evidence to suggest that your development appraisal is far more viable than it actually is. So you then get penalised for the fact that you are delivering BTR. not only that, but the margin, margin substantially reduces from what would have already been a reduced margin in the first place, because it is BTR. So I definitely think day one you've got to go in and explain the concept of build to rent, and I think that's easier if you've already got an investor partner ready there to do the deal with you. So if you're going in having that conversation with a local authority saying, look, our investor partner here is Invesco, and we're going to deliver this BTR scheme, it's far more tangible than just trying to get a residential consent.
Sure, interesting. In terms of Lambert Smith Hampton, then, I guess where you guys are as a business, what are your plans for build to rent? I mean, in terms of the team that you guys have got at the moment, obviously, I don't know what the mix of individuals that you got within your team, but where, as a company, as obviously managing the build to rent, I guess, team within LSH, where are you guys taking it? Is it you bringing in specifically more surveyors to help with the projects? Is it more in-house architects? What sort of plans for LSH internally for the next few years?
Yeah, well, I think obviously we've been fortunate enough to spot an opportunity before many of our competitors. So we launched the team 7 years ago, and we've had a great journey. And we have been involved in some of the biggest deals in the marketplace, which is always exciting. But actually, what you can never do, particularly from an agency point of view, is rest on your laurels and look back at the deals you have done. It's always about the next deal and progressing with the market. But I think from my point of view, again, the people who know me know how obsessed I am with data. And we're going to get ourselves into an exciting position across the next couple of months, in particular, actually, where we're going to have access to a lot of different data sets that we can really start to analyse, both in terms of ERVs. Is there a rental premium compared to normal standing stock, which we've already done a bit of work on, but we're going to take that into the next gear. Absorption rates, customer service, customer demand, etc., etc. So watch this space on the data side. But equally, I think one thing that really does excite me is having the ability to create a one-stop shop for many clients. So where you can provide not only the transactional advice and the deal, but also then you might be involved in the property management or the project monitoring, etc., etc. And so there's a lot of different services that the business can support our clients with. It's not necessarily just we've done the deal and then we've run off into the sunset. We want to provide a full service, either an acquisition or disposal service. So I think there's loads of work to do there. And then, as we've mentioned and alluded to, I'm really keen to start exploring the suburban market. So identifying both development partners, investors, and then opportunity in those suburban markets, and almost maybe using 2 or 3 examples to see if we can get a couple of case studies going where we can in 2-3 years time have a stable scheme and say, look, we took this from A to B with 2 or 3 of our key clients. So I think that's going to be really exciting.
For sure. No, it's exciting times, I think, for everyone in the sector, really, especially now they are, I guess, investor partners are looking at, I guess, also different markets, suburban areas. I think there's going to be more stock available. I think, especially in Manchester. Manchester's not too big of a place in terms of city centre. I think that, I guess, what schemes, what pieces of land are coming or what old buildings are coming to market. So it'd be nice to see different, I guess, opportunities, which is quite interesting. But Ian, I really appreciate all your time today. I mean, I just want, as a tradition, we always round up the podcast with a quote and a coffee. It's just, I guess, it's a bit of a cheesy question, but what your favourite quote is in terms of you live by, whether it's discussing with employees or how you, I guess, you conduct yourself or the business moving forward. And then if you was having a coffee, what would those 2 things be? So
the quote I always like is, I think it's Richard Branson actually. If your dreams don't scare you, they're not big enough. And I'm a skinny latte man actually. I always get I always get ribbed off my mates for that actually, because most people might know I'm not the skinniest person in the world myself. So when I order a skinny latte, there's a couple of raised eyebrows.
Is there any sugar-free caramel in there, or just normal latte?
No, just normal. Yeah. Again, I'm quite a simple man.
Good man. Glad to hear. Ian, I really appreciate your time, and I'm definitely interested to get some feedback on the podcast once it releases. So, Ian, I appreciate your time, and that is the Best in Property podcast with Ian Scott.
Cheers. Thank you.